In this quick start tutorial, we'll have a look at basic exporting and rendering of media in Mistika. There's two reasons why you'll need to render anything in Mistika. One might be to regain real-time playback if you've added so many effects or particular effects that don't run in real time. Although of course many things on Mistika don't need rendering, they will just play in real time as is. The other reason to render is obviously to create media to send, perhaps to a client or a different system. Either way, to render media for export or for playback, we go to the Output tab of the dashboard here. All of our options for creating media reside in this area. I won't go through everything in this tutorial because it's just a quick start. Have a look for a later one where we can go through every option in here. Let's just look at some basic stuff. We generally work along the panel from left to right in order to make the choices about the media that we are creating. So the first thing under channels is whether we want to create just pictures or pictures with audio or just audio from our timeline. Then over here we choose the format of the images that we're creating. Under the Mistika tab are the Mistika internal movie file formats. If you're just rendering to maintain real-time performance, then these are the best options for you. They're all uncompressed movies of various bit depths and colour spaces, with exception obviously of the XR file at the end. So for example, 8-bit YUV, 10-bit YUV, 8-bit, 10-bit or 16-bit RGB files. The Mistika internal movies are optimised for real-time playback. Moving on, if you wanted to export a movie file, obviously we click Movies, and under here various options to create particular movie files. A MOV RGB is an uncompressed movie file, or MPEG-4 for example. Note that when we've selected movie as an output format, some other options have appeared over here. Again, I won't go into them in too much detail now, but just to say that if you want to create a movie with embedded audio, then select the audio in movie. If that isn't selected, then Mistika will create a separate file for the video, the movie file, and a separate file for the audio file. Images is where we can choose an image format to render to. So obviously we have JPEGs and DPXs and J2Ks and TIFFs and TARGAs and the EXRs and all the usual things that you might want to use. The target below here refers to where Mistika saves files. Mistika works by having predefined paths of where media is stored, and this is to help with integration with other systems. Those paths are predefined in the mconfig application of Mistika on your desktop, and each path can come with a name, and it's those names that you're seeing in the target drop-down. So if you were to render, for example, a movie file or an image sequence, you can create multiple possibilities of where that file will be saved by default. If you're using a pre-existing Mistika installation, you'll probably just need to ask where those files are sent to. If it's a new installation, then have a look under the root folder for a folder such as Material or Mistika Storage or something obviously named, and you'll find your output media will end up in there somewhere. Still moving across, we can choose whether we want to render in progressive or interlaced, and we can give a name to the file that we want to render. Then under Do Render, we can either press Render in the foreground, which basically means Mistika should render as fast as it possibly can, or in the background, which means that you want to continue working and Mistika can use the spare processing power to render. So obviously that's a little bit slower, but at least you can still work. Before we render anything, we have to tell Mistika what it is we want to render, and we do that in one of two ways. Whatever single clip is selected will be the source for the render. So in this particular stack, I would select the top clip as the source for the render. So now simply clicking Foreground Render will kick off the renderer. And as you can see, when the clip is rendered, it simply adds a new clip on top of our stack, that clip being a rendered version of what was underneath it. And the clip will be, of course, in the format that we chose to render. So in this case, actually, it's a series of JPEG files. and on my particular system the path they've rendered to is /material/render, and then in there, because it's an image sequence, sequences, and the project name, and there's my render in a folder named accordingly. But as I say, this path and the names of the files are all subject to the settings in nconfig. If we want to render multiple things, for example, let's say it was part of an edit, then I can, instead of picking a single entity to render, I can specify a range of time on the timeline to render. And we do that with these edit marks down here. There are other uses for edit marks, but this is just in terms of exporting for now. So for example, if I entered an in point here and an out point there, you can see the shaded area. If I now went to output, in fact, it would render everything between the in mark and the out mark. You can clear the marks here. Or more simply, if I wanted to just render this collection of shots as a single render, then I can press the two edit marks together and it will wrap around my selection. Notice that the out mark, as is normal for editing protocol, is actually effectively on the first frame of the next shot. When you make a render, it will naturally render in the resolution that you have the system set to. So in this case 1920 by 1080, up here you can see. If I want to override that, down here, render resolution and framing, I can activate and click settings to get a mini menu, so I can change my pixel size or scales or offsets, or make it fit X or fit Y to give a particular size of output. Really, you should only use this for going to a lower resolution. It doesn't make much sense to use this to up-res material. For output media that is able to have an embedded timecode track, you can choose where the timecode comes from with this selection here. So I can use the timeline timecode, in other words, that'll be the code that's shown on the cursor here, or I can use the original source clip code, in which case whatever I render will now have this code from the original clip. So this is a method of maintaining codes throughout a workflow. Very important in many DI situations. There are many possibilities with the exporting settings of Mistika, and it's designed to allow the system to seamlessly work with other post-production systems and to build very efficient workflows. So in a later tutorial we'll go through all those options.